Hello, I'm Ron Duncan Hart, and welcome to these talks on Jews and the Arab world. We're going to be looking at Jews as one of the indigenous peoples in the Middle East, with their origins going back more than 4,000 years. We find it starting with Abraham in the city of Ur originally, and we will follow his story and the story of his descendants and how they are interwoven between the Jews and the Arabs. Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac, and the story really begins from there. In 2007, we began attending the synagogue in Tangier, Morocco, on a somewhat regular basis over a period of months, and then stretched into years. And it was there that I began to see again some of this interweaving of Jewish and Muslim life in Arab lands. Early in the process, I was sitting in the synagogue. We had finished the Minha service in the afternoon, and we were sitting there waiting for Mariv to start with sundown. And I was talking with Leon Asenkot, who had lived in Tangier all of his life and was one of the local Jewish families. And as he was telling me about some of the things of the Jewish experience there over the last 50 years, someone asked, "Have you heard it yet?" When they asked that question, "Have you heard it?" I wasn't quite sure what the point of reference was. I'd seen a clock at the entrance to the synagogue when we came in. I thought maybe there was something about the clock. I wasn't quite sure. And I didn't realize at the time that what they were actually waiting for was a signal about when sundown was actually occurring and Mariv could start. Now, one of the options is to go outside and look, and if you see 3 stars, sundown is complete and you can start the Mariv service. But in Morocco, one of the things that happens frequently, and in Muslim lands where there's a Jewish congregation, one of the things that happens frequently is people listen for the call of the muezzin. So if they hear the call of the muezzin for the evening prayers for the Muslim community, then they know that sundown is complete and that the Jewish community can also start their evening prayers. So a few minutes later, in fact, we did hear the call of the muezzin, and everyone picked up their sidurim. The leader went up to the bima, and we started the Mariv service. Let's take a look and see how Jewish and Arab lives have been intertwined from the beginning, even before Islam was a factor. We need to distinguish between Arabs and Muslims. We will be talking about Jews in the Arab world, and that is to be distinguished from the larger Muslim community in the world. The Arab communities are focused in the Peninsula of Arabia. When the Arabs came out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 600s, they occupied and Arabized neighboring areas. Egypt, which was not Arab originally, but became Arabized as the Arab forces moved in. Egypt had been Christian. They became Muslim over time, although there's still a significant Christian community left today. And as the Arab forces spread out, and we'll see a little bit later how that happened, they introduced Arab language, Islam, and Arab culture into neighboring areas. Turkey, Persia became Muslim, but they are not Arab. So in this lecture now, we will not be looking at Turkey and Iran because they are not Arab countries. They're Muslim. They speak different languages. Turkey, they speak Turkish language. Iran, they speak Farsi. And you spread out from there into Pakistan, on into Asia and into Africa, you find Muslim countries, but they're no longer Arab. There are about almost 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. Of those, about 400 million are Arabs. So we're going to be concentrating on the Arab part of the world. Here you can see the Arab countries that we were just talking about. And the dark green countries on the right side of the image are the ones concentrated around the Arabian Peninsula. So you can see the dark green areas are the Arab homeland areas. The lighter green areas are countries that are Arabized, which means they've had significant Arab influence, but not necessarily completely Arab. For example, in Morocco, the Constitution recognizes the founding populations of the country as Jewish, Berber, or Amazigh, and Arab. The Amazigh people today resist Arabization. They are Muslims. They have converted, but they keep their own language in large part, and are still very observant about their cultural traditions, and do not completely identify as Arabs. The Muslim world, which I was mentioning, is a much larger world, and you can see of the 1.5 billion people in 50 different countries. You have Arabs, you have sub-Saharan Africans, Persians, Turks, Europeans, South Asians by people of India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, Chinese Muslims, Indonesian Muslims in Philippines. So all of this Muslim world is a much larger world. We're going to be concentrating on the Arab part of that world because that's where Jews lived by and large. The largest Jewish communities were always in the Middle East, in the Arab lands. And that's where our focus will be. We start with Abraham. Abraham was from Ur, about 2000 BCE, or 4,000 years ago. According to Genesis, we know that Terah, the father, took Abraham and his wife Sarah and their nephew Lot, and they left Ur and traveled up the Tigris-Euphrates Valley into the place known as Haran. Now, living in Ur had been an urban setting, and they obviously had an urban occupation. By the time they arrived to Haran, and we pick up the story there, we see the Genesis referring to Abraham and Sarah moving on from there by themselves with their flocks. So they had become, in that transition, they had become nomadic, they had acquired herds, and began a different kind of lifestyle. In this map, you can see Ur located in the bottom right-hand corner, and as they traveled northward, Haran is closer to, but it's closer to Aleppo today. It's up in that region. So you can see they were traveling up the Euphrates, basically. Abraham made the covenant with God of monotheism, and he and Sarah separated from the family and migrated into Canaan, which God had instructed him was the land that would be for his descendants. One of the tribes that was important in the Middle East at this time were the Akkadians. They replaced Sumer as the dominant culture in the region. Part of the interesting thing here is that the language of Akkadian was to evolve into a series of Semitic languages, which today include Aramaic and Hebrew, which are closely related, and as a cousin language, Arabic. Sumer and the Akkadians have a link into the languages and the cultures that we are addressing we have stories that are parallel to some of those that appear in the first chapters of Genesis. One of them is the idea of a great flood, which was shared in Uruk and stories. We have the literature, the documentation of that. And on the right-hand side of this image, you will see a lamb or a goat that is caught in a bush, again reminding us of the story of the binding, which is going to become important later in the experience of Abraham. So the remarkable parallels that come into the early chapters of Genesis, we can see things even coming out of Sumer that connect us with Abraham's origins there. Abraham had two sons, and their story really becomes the story of the Jews and Arabs in the Middle East, Isaac and Ishmael. And it's the story of the two mothers, in fact. Ishmael was the firstborn son, as you know the story from Genesis. Sarah was not having children, and so she told Abraham that to have children, that he should go with the handmaid Hagar. And she did have a child, Ishmael, who was the firstborn. Later, Sarah also had a child, Isaac. And the two stories here, the two parallel stories, become very important in this history. In the Arab world, the firstborn child is the more important one. In Jewish world, the child of the Jewish mother is the important one, and that, of course, is Isaac. We know the story that Sarah became upset with the influence that Ishmael had, the older brother had over the younger brother, Isaac. She told Abraham that Hagar and her son had to leave. They did. And from there we find the splitting of the two stories. Ishmael then is understood to become the father of the Arabs. And if we pick up the story then on the Arab side in the Quran, we find that Ishmael and Hagar, his mother, settled in Arabia. In fact, they settled in Mecca. And that becomes an important part of the story later on. Now, one of the interesting things is that after Sarah died, Abraham married a second wife, and her name was Keturah, but many biblical scholars believe that she was Hagar, in fact. And one of the things that we do find is that Isaac and Ishmael kept their contact as half-brothers for much of their lives, at least, because we know that they were together to bury Abraham when he passed away. Picking up the story of Ishmael, we can begin to see the interlinking between Islam and Judaism. And Islam sees Abraham as one of the founding patriarchs, the founding fathers. So the story is that after the Great Flood, the Kaaba, the house of God in Mecca, in Islamic tradition, was actually originally founded by Adam, but it was destroyed in the Great Flood. And when Ishmael was there, Abraham came to visit him, and together they rebuilt the Kaaba. The Kaaba is the sacred house of God in Mecca, and it's the place where the pilgrims come and march around it 7 times. The black stone, which is a famous cornerstone in the Kaaba, according to the Islamic tradition, Abraham and Ishmael put the black stone in place. And Islam identifies Abraham as the founder. In Genesis, we see Abraham taking Isaac to Mount Moriah, and with everything except the sacrificial lamb. And when they arrived, of course, Abraham did the binding of Isaac and came to the very point of what he understood he was supposed to do in the sacrifice when the lamb appeared and caught in the bushes, as we saw from the image of earlier. In Islam, there's a similar account, identical, except that the son that Abraham took to Mount Moriah and bound for the sacrifice was Ishmael, not Isaac. The binding in Islam is one of the most celebrated religious holidays today. Every family is expected to have a sheep, take the sheep home, sacrifice it, and then there is a huge meal with the family. And in a way, this is almost like Thanksgiving in North America. It's a time when the family comes together, there's a celebration, there's abundant food, and it's remembering the binding and the saving of Ishmael and the ultimate story that human sacrifice is not a part of religious worship. Now, Jews in the Arab world are Arabs. Arab is a cultural identification. It's not a religious one necessarily, because there are Arabs who are Muslim, there are Arabs who are Jews, and there are Arabs who are Christians. So it's not uncommon, for example, in a synagogue in Arab-speaking lands, during the service, to hear someone call out, Allah Akbar, Allah Akbar. And the first time I heard that, it called my attention, and I realized that someone was simply saying in Arabic, God is great, God is great. So Jews speak Arabic, Jews work with their friends who are Arabic, and the Arabic lifestyle, the family organization, the food, Jews live in this Arabic world. And it's much like what happens in Europe, of course, where Jews speak European languages, eat European foods, dress like Europeans, and even the culture and the family organization is European-like. So one of the things to understand is that Arabs are Jews and very proud and identify with this tradition. Jews lived in Arabia even before there were Muslims there. We know that from the Roman period, at least, there were Jews living in Arabia. And Jewish merchants lived in what is today Yemen, the southern part of Arabia, which in Roman times was called Felix Arabia, which means the happy place of Arabia. As the Jewish uprisings against the Romans increased in the land of Israel, and the Romans expelled, not only defeated the Jewish uprisings, but expelled many people, we know that they were sent out to the edges of the Roman Empire, and many people just migrated there themselves. The closest place to migrate to was Arabia. Romans also expelled people to the western end of the Mediterranean, which is today Spain. Many of the Jews, though, during that time being expelled from Israel, went a little bit further east into Iraq and Iran, which were out on the eastern ends of the Roman Empire. So we find Jews being spread to all of these areas around the edges of the Roman Empire, and one of those was Arabia. When the Arabs had their major expansion in the 600s and 700s out of the Arabian Peninsula to occupy much of the known world. They basically occupied all of the lands where there were Jews, except the Rhineland region. Everything else, from Spain, across North Africa, Arabia, and that's where the majority of Jews lived. The Jewish population came under the control of Muslim rulers in most of the known world, with the one exception of the Rhineland. So as the Arabs began to expand into these areas, they also began encountering some pre-existing Jewish populations. What is the interaction between Judaism and Islam? As we know, both religions are monotheistic, and the complete belief that there is one and only God with no physical representation of God. Both Judaism and Islam see Abraham as being the founder. Moses was the next major prophet in both traditions. Moses led the children of God, the Hebrews, out of Egypt in Genesis. And in the Quran, we also find the story of Moses leading the children of God out of Egypt. The Torah is God's word to Moses. The Quran is God's word to Muhammad. God is the creator and the possessor of all knowledge. The parallels are strong between the two traditions. Where does Judaism come from? So after the reign of Solomon, as you know, the kingdom of Israel broke into two parts, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, with the 10 tribes, was conquered eventually by the Assyrians, and they became the 10 lost tribes. The survivors were the two southern kingdoms of Judah and Benjamin, located around Jerusalem, and they became the heart of Judaism as it has come down to us. Judaism is based in the tribal origins in the Middle East of these two surviving tribes. Who are Muslims? Muslims are people who submit to God. And Islam actually means submission to God. Islam began with the Arab tribes in Mecca and Medina. And part of the difference between Judaism and Islam is that Judaism has kept its identity as an ethnic tradition with descent from Abraham, whereas Islam, as a proselytizing religion, is not based in the original descent from one of the Arab tribes, but is based on anyone who accepts the message that Muhammad brought. So it's anyone who accepts the submission to God can become a Muslim. So we have African Muslims, we have Asian Muslims, European Muslims, Muslims from all the parts of the world, the major continents. And one of the distinguishing factors between Judaism and Islam is this element. The exclusivity of monotheism is critical in both Judaism and Islam. In Exodus, we have the following verse: I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, and you shall have no other gods before me. In the Quran, the Surah 2, we have this verse: and your God is one God, there is no God but he, most gracious, most merciful. Muhammad was born in 570 of the Common Era and lived to 632. He was 62 years old when he passed away. He was born into a world that was dominated by the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire, which was Zoroastrian. So it was a Christian and a Zoroastrian world. Now the Arabs at that time were people who looked at much more at local gods. They were not a part of monotheism. Muhammad was born into the Quraysh clan, and the Quraysh clan actually was in charge of the house of God, the Kaaba. During that time, it was an important area of it was a site of pilgrimage, and Being in charge of it was a financial benefit to them because pilgrims were coming all the time and they needed food and everything else. He was orphaned early on, and he went to live with an uncle who actually lived outside of Mecca and lived a traditional nomadic life. So Muhammad grew up tending sheep, tending the herds. That was his job as a child. As he became older, he got involved in the caravan trade, taking goods from Mecca, probably that were coming up from Yemen, and then from Mecca on up to Syria. And so we know that a large part of his education was involved in contact with that part of the world, which would have put him in contact with Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. Now, Muhammad did not have a formal education. He didn't read or write. And so his learning was a learning of oral traditions, the things that he must have heard on the caravan routes. When he was 25 years old, he headed a caravan for a widow in Mecca whose name was Khadija. And in the process, he got to know her well. She was older. She was 40 years old at the time. But as they worked together, they became involved and they were married. Khadija was wealthy, and this gave Muhammad more time, more leisure time to begin to look into other aspects of life. As we know that when Muhammad was 40 years old, he began to go into the mountains around Mecca to meditate, and sometimes he'd spend long periods of time in the mountains meditating and thinking about life. The angel Gabriel appeared to him and told him that he was to be a messenger of God. Muhammad was frightened by this. He wasn't quite sure what was this vision that he had. Went back, he told Khadija about it. She assured him that he should believe the vision that he had had. He continued the meditations, and there were other visions that came to him, confirming that he was to be the messenger of God for the Arabs, and to take the truth of monotheism to the Arab world. At one point in one of the visions, Muhammad was taken to Jerusalem, to what is the Temple Mount that we know of today. And standing on the rock, supposedly the same rock where Ishmael would have been bound, he ascended into heaven, and he stood before God and Abraham and Moses and Jesus, and was given the more explicit direction to carry the word of monotheism and the truth to the Arab people. It's on that site today that we have the Dome of the Rock built. After the night of splendor, Muhammad returned to his life and began doing the teachings. And there were followers that came around him in Mecca. You know the story probably that there was opposition in Mecca. There was a traditional religious establishment around the Kaaba, and Muhammad seemed to be challenging that traditional religious establishment. The people from Medina came to him and said that they would welcome him there. And so Muhammad went to Medina in 622, and in Medina he was accepted as the leader of the community. Muhammad had been teaching at this point that people should pray toward Jerusalem. When Muhammad arrived to Medina, there were 3 Jewish tribes there: Banu Nadir, Banu Qurayza, Banu Kainuga. And we know that they did not respond to Muhammad's message. And this led fairly quickly to the expulsion of the Banu Kainuga, that was the poorest and the weakest of the tribes. They were primarily craftsmen and artisans, so early on they were expelled. The Banu Nadir was a wealthy tribe, and they actually challenged Muhammad, and eventually they were expelled. And their stories about the expulsion, that they were able to take all of their camels and all of their wealth, and the women dressed in their finest silks and clothing, and they rode proudly out of town, leaving. There was one tribe left, the Banu Qurayza, and this was a tribe that had also challenged Muhammad, and there was actually a physical attack on them. All the men were killed in that tribe, and the women and children were enslaved. The original encounter of Muhammad with the Jewish tribes of Medina did not look favorable for the future of Judaism within Islam. Over the last 1,300, 1,400 years, the coexistence between Jews and Muslims has largely been a favorable one. There have been times of problems. Jews were not free of discrimination, but they were free of persecution, like happened in the Christian world. Bernard Lewis, one of the important historians about Jews in the Arab lands, says, Jewish lives under Arab rulers was never as bad as in Christendom at its worst, but it was never as good as it was in Christendom at its best. There were no expulsions of Jews like in England, France, and Spain. There was no Spanish Inquisition. There were no pogroms like in Russia. Nothing like the Nazi Holocaust. But on the other hand, there was never the emancipation of Jews, as happened with Menashe ben Israel, as he was pushing for equal rights for Jews. Jews never got full citizenship or full rights as citizens, as happened in France under Napoleon, and then later in other countries. So Jewish life in the Muslim world was without the major persecutions, but also without being full citizens at any point. Some of the greatest Jewish scholars of all time have been in the Muslim world, the Arabic world. These were Arab Jews. Starting with Saadia Gaon, who was one of the major leaders of introducing Judaism into the Arabic language. He actually translated the Torah into Arabic, still used today. Major religious scholarship in Arabic. Saadia Gaon was one of the major religious scholars forming Judaism as it was going into the Middle Ages and before the modern era. Maimonides, whom we all know, in Egypt, by the time we get to the 1100s, 1200s, Maimonides was the major Jewish scholar that was beginning to introduce Judaism into the early modern period. He was considered a major Arabic scholar today. He wrote in Arabic, particularly all of his medical treatises. Judah Halevi, coming out of medieval Spain, wrote in Arabic. Ibn Gabriel in philosophy and poetry, and on and on. And we'll look at many of these names further on. One of the things to understand about Islam that impacts Judaism today is the division between Sunnis and Shiites. Muhammad, when he passed away, did not have a son. In the Arabic tradition, patriarchal, there was no direct heir. The people around him decided that the person who should succeed him as the leader of the Islamic movement was Abu Bakr, his very close friend and ally who had always supported him. So he was chosen as the successor, as the caliph. And the next couple of leaders were also chosen the same kind of way. But there was always a group that thought that the caliph or the leader of Islam should be someone from the family of Muhammad. The fourth caliph was elected, Ali was elected from that line. And then the next caliph was, again, back to the community selecting a person, not connected to Muhammad. So the split began there between Sunnis and Shiites. Most of the Arab world is actually Sunni. So the Shiite axis really goes from Iran today over to Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. And the Sunni world is most of the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Yemen, Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Morocco. The Arab expansion was amazing. Muhammad, in the last 10 years of his life, from 622 to 632, basically united the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, one of the things that's important to understand a bit about Islam is that the leader of Islam is not only a religious leader, but also a political leader and a military leader. And this is something that's unique in Islam. It's the fusion of religion, politics, and military leadership into the caliph, the person who's the head of Islam. As you look at this map about the expansion of the Arabs between 622 and 711, you'll see that in a matter of 80, 90 years, they spread quickly out of the Arabian Peninsula, across North Africa, across the Middle East, and on the east, the yellow section on the east goes all the way up to what is present-day Pakistan, the Indus River Valley. And on the west, it goes, of course, all the way to Spain. By 711, most Jews in the world lived under Muslim control. We get, at this point, the famous Pact of Umar, which is the legal authority about Jews living under Muslim rule. Now, one of the accounts says that the Pact of Umar was made in 637 when Arab forces took Jerusalem and the large Jewish population that was there. And the decision was made that they need a formal legal structure to interpret the role of Jews in Islam. It defines the dhimmi status. Dhimmi means the special status of people of the book. People who are monotheists, basically is what it means. So people who had the Torah, Jews. People who had the Bible, Christians. And even Zoroastrians could be included in this. They were not supposed to be proselytized. To a certain extent, their religion was to be respected. They were a minority group within the dominant Muslim society. They had to pay a special tax. They didn't have all of the rights of Muslims, but they had freedom of religion. And basically, they could live most of their life as they needed to do. They could be in the government. They could participate in commerce. And we even find that there are times when Jewish government leaders occupy very important positions. There were Jews who became prime ministers of governments. One of the important stories that occurs with the expansion of the Arabs and Islam across North Africa is Damia al-Kahina. She's one of the most important women, Jewish women. Damia al-Kahina was the Jewish queen of a Berber tribe in the Maghreb, that area between Algeria and Morocco. Now, we know that there are Berber Jewish tribes. Today in Morocco, there are still Berber Jews. And there are many stories about how Jews came to be Berbers in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco and Algeria. Basically, the story is that at the fall of each of the temples, the first temple and then later the fall of the second temple, there was a Jewish migration coming out of Israel and going across North Africa. And these Jews arrived at the Atlas area. And in the process, either they settled in and intermarried with Berber tribes. Some say that Berber tribes converted to Judaism. As the Muslim advance was coming across Libya, out of Egypt into Libya and into Algeria, the Berbers began to resist this Arab advance. They didn't want this foreign civilization coming in. And Dami al-Kahina becomes the person who organizes the various Berber tribes. Now, it wasn't only her tribe, but it was a coalition of Berber tribes. And it seems, from what we can tell, a period of 30 years or so, she was able to unite the tribes on different occasions to fight off Arab armies. They would have battles, there'd be a truce, there'd be a period of peace. Again, the Arab armies would make an advance, there'd be another battle. But basically for 30 years, she seemed to have led the coalition that stopped the Arab advance. In 702, 701 or 702, occurred the final battle between the Arabs and the Berbers, and they were finally defeated. And Dami al-Kahina was killed during that battle. We don't know exactly where her grave is, but the legend lives on about her. And she really has become a legend in this part of the world today. Many people see her as being an important feminist, a woman leader, a woman who could be a battle leader, who could be a queen and the leader of a tribe, a ruler. In Arabic, the term kahina, and the name Dami al-Kahina actually comes from Arabic sources. We don't know much about her in the West, so it's the reason her story is a particularly important one. Kahina in Arabic actually means someone who is a sorcerer or a priest. Arabic and Hebrew are very close together. The Hebrew word that is comparable to this is Kohen. So, or Cohen. So Damia al-Kahina was perhaps Cohen, of a Kohen family, which would mean that she had a special religious connotation. In 711, Tariq, the leader of the Muslim forces in Morocco at that point, invaded Spain. Now again, this was only 9 years after the defeat of, 8 or 9 years after the defeat of Dami al-Kahina. When the Arabs arrived, the Jews welcomed them and actually helped the Muslim expansion into Spain. The Muslims did not require conversion. The Christians had been trying to convert Jews. Under the Muslims, they had freedom of religion. They didn't have the persecution they had under the Christians. And Jews very rapidly became an important part of this new Muslim Spain. By 720, Muslim forces had occupied the entire Iberian Peninsula, and even, in fact, pushed on beyond the Pyrenees into France. Later, they were to come back and basically settle for Spain, parts of which they ruled for the next 800 years, basically. As we look at the Jews in Arab lands, we will be looking at two different tracks or two different origins of these Jewish traditions in Arab lands. One of them was the people coming out of Spain, the Sephardic Jews. When Ferdinand and Isabel expelled all the Jews in 1492, many of them went into Morocco and then later into the Ottoman Empire. So many of the Spanish Jews went to live in the Muslim world, which was open and welcoming to Jews. The other track of Jews in the Muslim world were the Mizrahi Jews, meaning the Eastern Jews, the people from Syria and Iraq, the Babylon, Baghdad group, which had always lived in the Arab part of the world. They weren't Sephardic. They spoke Arabic. They were Arabic Jews. So we find a fusion later on between Sephardic Jews coming in from Spain, from the expulsion. And remember, they had been living under Muslim rule in Spain. And with the expulsion, they simply moved into Muslim lands that felt more familiar to them. And the Mizrahi Jews from Iraq and the Middle East, who had always lived in the Arab territories. And these became the two major populations of Jews living in Arab lands. Part of the similarity between Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews is the liturgical tradition, which continues being the same. Religious scholars from Maimonides, to Sadia Gaon, write in Arabic and share ideas there. So you have that tradition which is running independently of the Jewish tradition that developed in the Rhineland and in Eastern Europe, which becomes the Ashkenazi tradition. Ashkenazi Jews always lived under Christian rule. Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews always lived under Muslim rule. Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews spoke Arabic and developed Judeo-Spanish and Judeo-Arabic languages, dialects. The Jews of Eastern Europe and Russia spoke Yiddish and had that language tradition. The foods were different. The Jews of the Ashkenazi world, Eastern Europe and so on, had a potato-based food tradition. The Jews of the Arab lands had a couscous, in some places rice-based tradition. It's more of a Mediterranean diet. So we find these cultural differences. Dress were different, music was different. The music of the Sephardic world, for example, is ballads, the romances. They tell stories. It's not dance music. In the Ashkenazi world, the music developed as klezmer. It's dance music. So we begin to find these cultural differences developing between the Jews of the Arab world and the Jews of the European Ashkenazi world. Spain also developed to have the largest Jewish population in Europe at the time. And that becomes part of the story that we will see going further on. And then after that, we'll look at what was happening during that same time period in the Middle East.